Is hindsight bias destroying your life? Or alternatively, why is hindsight bias destroying your life? Is hindsight bias a good thing, or is hindsight bias a bad thing? Today, we're going to be discussing hindsight bias. Hi, my name's Nathan, and I mostly talk about concepts such as dyspraxia, what is dyspraxia, promoting awareness of dyspraxia, solutions of dyspraxia, and I also talk about my social enterprise, Neuroexpressions, which is about empowering neurodivergent artists and neurodivergent communities. But today, we're going to be speaking about hindsight bias. So this is like a video essay, kind of. So let's start this off with my hindsight bias. So I predicted the growth of YouTube. I predicted the exponential growth of female boxing, and I predicted the decline of NFTs. Now I know what you're thinking. Where's your evidence that you predicted any of this? There is no evidence, but this is my hindsight bias. And those three predictions, which were basically conversations with myself, were just, at the very best, educated guesses that happened to come true. And then afterwards, you can say them with conviction because they did come true. And let's bear in mind, there's probably 100 other things that I predicted that were incorrect. And here's a really important question. Listen to this question. How many people predicted the 2008 recession before it happened? And the answer to that question will give you an insight into how powerful hindsight bias is. Let me explain that point. If so many people have great predictive powers, how come so many financial experts did not predict the 2008 financial recession? And if so many people are so good at predictions, how come gambling shops overwhelmingly make tremendous profits? And in many cases, I don't think it's deliberate lying, even though in some cases it clearly is, but I think it's more about the issue with human memory, but we might touch upon that a bit later. And clearly, it's the brain reinterpreting information. Let's give an example. Let's take a football match. So let's say I think that Team A might win. And then, once the match is finished, Team A does win. So I've gone from Team A might win to when the event has occurred, I've gone, oh, I knew Team A was going to win. You see that shift, the narrative bias shift? Before the event, I thought they may win. After the event, I knew they were going to win. So let me tell you about my relationship with hindsight bias. So I was in a random place in Wales. I was at a station and I was waiting for a train, and I thought, let me get a book to, help me with the journey. So I went into a bookshop and I was looking at all these different titles. Can't remember what the titles was, my bad. I have dyspraxia, which means I have a bad memory. But the one thing I do remember is that there was this one title that really stood out called The Art of Thinking Clearly. So I purchased the book, and when I read the book, one of the chapters dealt with the concept of hindsight bias. So this is when I first encountered that term. And on a side note, this book was a phenomenal book that really helped me with my logical thinking. Okay, so I've been talking a little bit now about hindsight bias, but I think before we move forward, perhaps we should start off by giving a definition of hindsight bias. So hindsight bias is the following: the tendency people have to assume that they know the outcome of an event after the outcome has already been determined. So I think we've given a few examples, but let's give another one. Let's say John has become a scientist and someone says, I knew he was going to be a great scientist because he did well in science class. It sounds good, but it's all hindsight bias because it's being stated after the event. Alternatively, if someone says before the outcome that John will be a great scientist, then by default, it's not hindsight bias. But why is hindsight bias a bad thing? Or is hindsight bias a bad thing? Let's look at this and give an example. So I think hindsight bias is negative, but why is it negative? I think it's negative because hindsight bias, or people that have extreme levels of hindsight bias, has a negative subtext. Now I know what you're thinking. What is a negative subtext? Let me give you an example. If your partner says to you, "Do I look big in this?" the subtext is, "Do you love me?" And if I go to my manager and I say, "What do you think of my work?" the subtext may be, "Can you validate me as an effective and efficient worker?" So when it comes to the subtext within the hindsight bias context, I would argue that people that have extreme levels of hindsight bias, there will be a subtext of having an extreme level of arrogance. Now remember, there's a difference between arrogance and confidence. And having high levels of hindsight bias, i.e. you're correct about everything, that is translated as arrogant. So then the next question could be, is arrogance a negative thing? And I would argue that the answer to that question is yes. I think it's important to establish the difference between confidence and arrogance. And the best way to do this is through an actual example. So let's take a job interview. So let's say I turn up to a job interview, I have a suit on and I turn up, I'm polite, but I'm confident. I'm confident in my body language and I'm confident in the way I answer the questions. Now if I answer those questions efficiently, I would argue that my confidence would be seen as a good thing. Now let's replace confidence with arrogance with the same scenario. So I turn up to the job interview in a suit, but I'm arrogant and I answer the questions in an arrogant way. This would be seen as negative. So basically, if we can see a correlation between high levels of hindsight bias and arrogance, then this generally would be seen as a negative thing. And you may have asked the question saying to yourself, well, just because someone has elements of hindsight bias, it doesn't mean they're arrogant. And that may be true. And you may also argue that all humans have elements of hindsight bias. That also may be true. But as I've stated, if you have an excessive level of hindsight bias, meaning that you know everything after the event, then my question would be, how could that not be perceived as being arrogant? And this is so interesting to me. So, hindsight bias can cause what some would call overconfidence, but I would call arrogance. And here's a question within itself. What is the difference between overconfidence and arrogance? And are either of them positive? But we're deflecting a little bit. But when we take this overconfidence or we take this arrogance, we are not learning from real mistakes, because the hindsight bias invents mistakes. And that means hindsight bias is negatively affecting reflective practice. Now I know what you're thinking. What is reflective practice? From my perspective, reflective practice is this. An event happens and you reflect on it. So you may think, what went well, what went wrong, and how can it be improved? And this is a great way. This is definitely a great way to progress professionally. It's definitely a great way to progress within your relationships. Definitely a good method for an entrepreneur. But the hindsight bias affects this narrative because we invent the mistakes. From this perspective, the utilization of hindsight bias is attacking the human context. And as I look further into hindsight bias, I thought to myself, is there a psychological need? Is there a human psychological need with hindsight bias? And then you may say, what is this psychological need? And this need is for us to understand. So for example, hindsight bias may enable us to think that we understand why we didn't get that job. It enables us to think that we understand why the relationship didn't work. It enables us to think that we understand why the business failed. In this sense, hindsight bias, it fits a psychological need, but a subjective truth can be damaging if you're using it to improve your life. So for example, if you're using hindsight bias and your hindsight bias is distorted due to human memory, then this could influence your actions, and those actions could actually be detrimental to your development. So I was thinking about hindsight bias, and as I was thinking about it, I had a question, and that question was the following: is there a relationship between hindsight bias and memory? So is there a relationship between hindsight bias and memory? And if so, what is that relationship? So when I looked into this, what I found was that there was articles that would state that scientifically, memories, human memories, that's the context, human memories are really bad at accurately recounting events. So what does this mean with regards to hindsight bias? Well, if the human memory is bad at recounting events, that would mean, in my mind, that would make hindsight bias even worse. And you may be asking the question, and it's a valid question, aren't memories different? So if, for example, Jack may have a good memory, but Sally may have a bad memory. And I guess that, that's a credible response. But I think there's a difference here. And yes, someone could have a good memory and someone could have a bad memory. But if we can objectively say that generally speaking, human memories are bad, then this spells even more problems for hindsight bias. So if memories are objectively not very good, then we should almost assume that our hind bias will be completely unreliable. So why? Why is human memory so bad? It's a good question. Well, the first premise is that we remember traumatic experiences over positive ones. And then there's a second premise. And the second premise is that it's not that we don't remember, we misremember. And misremember means simply to remember incorrectly or fail to remember. And there are also further elements to this situation that can sabotage memory. So we can have dopamine deficiency, we can have anxiety, physical illness, etc. Now it dawned on me that social intelligence is important. And when I say it's important to the context of hindsight bias. But why? Why is social intelligence important, and why is it important to hindsight bias? Now, when we ask the question of why social intelligence is important, we can have a few references here. So we have the book, I believe it's by Dale Carnegie, on how to win friends and influence people. And that's a very good book which articulates the importance of effective social intelligence. I also believe Robert Greene in the book Mastery also touches on this subject. So human development, one can argue, is it predicated on social intelligence? Let me put it another way. For us to evolve within each other, we need to have social intelligence. So, think about your workplace. To get on with your colleagues, that takes social intelligence. To get on with your manager, that takes a form of social intelligence. But why is social intelligence and hindsight bias important? Well, remember that we spoke about arrogance. So if hindsight bias, extreme levels of hindsight bias, can cause arrogance, then we have this other equation where does arrogance affect social intelligence? And I think arrogance does affect social intelligence. And if we have this equation of hindsight bias affecting or causing arrogance, then there's a clear relationship between these three different elements. So it's important to realize that hindsight bias, when activated to a certain level, can trigger arrogance, and this can affect social intelligence. And social intelligence is so important for the human context. So in conclusion, hindsight bias may be destroying your life for the following reasons. Number one, it's making you arrogant. Number two, it's making you think you're smarter than what you actually are. Number three, it's affecting your social intelligence. Number four, it's giving you a useless subjective truth. And finally, number five, it's destroying reflective practice and your ability to develop. In a sense, hindsight bias tries to make sense of a complicated world, Perhaps there is a psychological need for knowing, and hindsight bias partly fulfills this need to a point. Maybe in one sense hindsight bias can make one feel safe. But how do we deal with hindsight bias? We need to try and look at things objectively and perhaps accept that sometimes there are no simple narratives, but that's another video essay. Life is complex and it has many different variables. The philosopher Socrates came up with the concept of Socratic questioning. In a simple sense, this is a method for exploring truth. Perhaps if we can question oneself objectively, we can lessen the effect of hindsight bias. So that was my video essay. If you enjoyed that, then why not like and subscribe? Also, I have a social enterprise that empowers neurodivergent people, neurodivergent artists, and is trying to build a neurodivergent community. If you want to know more about that, then check out my website, link in the description.